Wanted to welcome everybody here to the first of the annual Dovi Afesi Lecture Series. We figured that there would be no better way to honor his memory than to set up an annual lecture series based around the things that he taught and he fought for during his time here at GCC and beyond. We had several candidates that put in ideas for this series, and David Lanoie, coordinator of criminal justice here at GCC. He's been here for about 15 years and was in the criminal justice system as a worker, not gotta make sure I say that. For about 28 years, so tons and tons of experience. I don't need to say anything else. Without any further ado, David Lanoie.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're on film, so I was told that I can't do too much walking around the room, so I'm going to try to confine myself to this space, which could be an analog for the topic, prisonization of the speaker, while I talk about the prisonization of America. So let me first say that after almost 29 years in the college classroom and 28 years in the prison system as an administrator, I have spoken publicly and in the classroom, and I'm a little nervous today. I am so honored to have been chosen to be the first lecturer in this series, which honors the great contribution to this community and to the world that Dovi Afesi represents. I can't tell you how humbled I am to be given the opportunity to speak on a topic that relates to his legacy. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to get to know him. But I had a wonderful opportunity this past summer to come pretty close. In a beautifully appointed home in the town of East Hampton, overlooking the mountain range, I met Mary Hurley. And she's here today, and I want to thank her for being here. As Dovi's life partner, Mary was welcoming. She welcomed me into the home. She welcomed me into her life. Never met before, and we had a wonderful opportunity to converse. We shared laughter. We shared quiet moments. We shared tears. And I was able to be able to grasp in a more significant way the passion that Dovi brought to this community and that he brought to the subject matter of history. And I know we have time constraints, but I think it's important to dwell upon that because historical, political, and ethical awareness were the pillars of Dovi's commitment and passion with respect to teaching and his contributions to society. And I have to say that although I can never approximate that, I share it. And it's such an honor to be able to come here today, and I have a slide presentation that I'm going to use. I want to talk to you about an important issue, and I want to talk about it from an awareness of the political and historical and criminal justice events that have led us to a place in our society wherein we, as a society, have significant road to cover with respect to our treatment of our fellow human beings. And so the title of my talk today is The Prisonization of America, Racial and Socio-economic Disparities in the Age of Equal Rights. It's unbelievable, don't you think, that in America we have to talk about that? Isn't that unbelievable? I've had the privilege of 28 years of direct experience in the prison system. And I can tell you that we've made strides there. And I think we all know that we've made strides, as Mary and I talked about, in the area of racial relations. But when we talk about justice in America, the question is, what is that? When we talk about social justice in America, the question is, what is that? And when we talk about racial justice in America, I think we all know how that should look. I think we all know how that should feel. But I just want to suggest these things today. If we don't have justice, if we can't achieve justice in our criminal justice system, in our social policy, in our public policy, how do we get to social justice And then how do we get to racial justice? And that is my commitment today, is to talk about that. And that's difficult to talk about because it requires us to look in the mirror. It requires me to admit that I have white privilege. And it requires me to be aware of the fact that because of that, I'm subject to implicit racial bias. And so today I'm going to talk about uncomfortable things, because we can't get to mass prisonization in our nation, which affects the African American community in dastardly ways, without talking about hard things. But we're a learning community. This is, in my view, where it's most important for us to talk about these subjects and how we got there. So the template for today's talk is going to be based upon two concepts: power theory in America and our predisposition toward racism. Very difficult things to talk about. And let me suggest to you that as I go through this lecture, we can't point to any specific person and say it's their fault. We can't point to specific groups and say, all the blame is over there. We are an imperfect nation with an imperfect polity, but we are a nation. Therefore, as I make my remarks, let's remember that we're stakeholders in our community, we're stakeholders in our states and in our nation, and we all bear responsibility for the public policy and how it's expressed. In the area that I've chosen in my life is criminal justice. Criminal justice is an extension of our social policy, it's an extension of our politics, and therefore it's an extension of ourselves. And so let me begin with some statistics. So in the United States of America, we represent 5% of the world's population. We represent 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. The Pew Center on the States reported, and they're a pretty trustworthy group, the Pew Center on the States reported that by 2009, 1 in 31 Americans was under some form of correctional supervision in the United States of America. And you see on the board here, there's a quote from a great article that was forwarded to me a few years ago from the New Yorker magazine that talks about the number of people in America that are under correctional supervision being about 6 million, and that rivals the Gulag operated during the Stalinist era. Therefore, mass incarceration in the United States of America, the most advanced democracy on the planet, is in a scale that is unexampled in American history. That in and of itself is tough to comprehend, right? Let's think about African American incarceration in the United States. African American males make up about 1/7 of the population, maybe a little less depending upon the age group that we choose. So we're talking about maybe between ages 18 to 25. African American males, however, make up 40+% of the state and federal prison population. African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate of 5 times that of whites. Just in terms of states, it's amazing when you look at these numbers. Maryland tops the nation for incarceration of African Americans. 72% of the Maryland prison population is African American. 72%. Now, you may think, well, they're near Washington, D.C., which is a high population of African Americans, but the fact of the matter is the way Washington, D.C. manages its correctional system is they have pretrial detention in the city, Washington, D.C., in the District of Columbia, and then people who are sentenced from the District of Columbia go out to all the states, because the District of Columbia does not maintain a prison system analogous to the states. And so the Maryland numbers could partially reflect the demographic makeup of the District of Columbia, but not completely. And so that's a pretty sobering statistic. 50% of Michigan's prison population and New Jersey's prison population and the population of the Illinois prison system is made up of African American men. Massachusetts is a little tough because the houses of correction, we're the only state with a dual prison system. Houses of correction are managing a prison population of sentenced people here on felonies and misdemeanors up to a maximum time of 2.5 years. And we also have a separate state prison population. The state prisons are the only ones that report. The houses of correction don't report, so they're not covered in the crime statistics that are issued by the federal government. So we come up with a 7-to-1 ratio of 7 times the likelihood in terms of the disparity that an African American will be incarcerated in Massachusetts, and we aren't sure. We assume that we have at any given time about 5,400 people incarcerated in the 13 houses of correction here in the state. And so a significant portion of those people, particularly in the urban counties, are of African American heritage. So today, Adam Gottnick reminds us that there are more people, there are more black people, African American people, in the grip of criminal justice than there were in slavery in 1850. And the number, does anybody know what that number is? How many people were enslaved? In 1850, there were about 2.3 million Americans under the system of slavery. So I want to spend some time now beginning to speak about causes of disparity, just to give this the template that we need. So out of the box, let's talk about the causes of disparity. So there are 3 things that the research indicates cause disparity. The first is policies that drive it. And we're going to talk about that in terms of, I picked urban renewal, and I've picked unionization as 2 very important concepts that we can look at in terms of the demographic and the history and the politics to understand how we've gotten to ghettoization of urban America and how we've gotten to this place. And the other is the drug war. Okay? So policies that drive disparity. The second is implicit bias in decision-making, something I said at the top of the lecture. If we're willing to recognize who we are, then we're willing to accept the possibility that maybe we engage. We have a go-to place that we have to avoid, which involves bias. And the third is something that folks who are sort of wedded to this law and order idea. Law and order sounds beautiful and it's great, and the picture of law and order is, very clean streets and tranquil neighborhoods, isn't it? But that's not reality. That's not the real world. That's not how any world operates. And so structural disadvantages in communities of color are the third sort of research-based driver of disparity. But we have to consider this because this is real. This isn't something we just get from a book. So I want to talk about the legal death of Jim Crow. We were on the road to something in 1954 when the United States Supreme Court said no to Plessy versus Ferguson's ridiculous doctrine of separate but equal. Inherent discrimination, inherent inequality, saying to an African American child who's going to elementary school, it's okay to go to a separate school. So in 1954, Justice Earl Warren convinced 8 other justices to vote with him unanimously to overturn that doctrine. That doctrine was based in lack of understanding. It was based in racism. It was based in a heritage that William Stuntz, professor at Harvard University, calls a constitution worship that we somehow suffer from in the United States. And we really don't like to talk about that, but I'm going to talk about it today. And then we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we have really sort of this opening of the floodgates in terms of, the rights of individuals to seek redress for their grievances under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We have the Supreme Court in 1960 announcing finally that an American prisoner is not a slave of the state. How does that happen? 100 years of judicial doctrine that suggests that American prisoners are slaves of the state, and we know that Jim Crow is in full force in many states. Brown versus Topeka opens up some floodgates. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, obviously. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so the question becomes, is it enough to have a judicial pronouncement? We know the answer to that question. It's a pronouncement. In the late 1990s, the Supreme Court was still enforcing Brown versus Topeka Board of Education in southern states. Can you imagine that? How do we grasp that? But it was happening. We're all familiar with the new Jim Crow, I hope. If you haven't read it, please read it. by Michelle Alexander, a brilliant African-American woman, an attorney and a professor at Ohio State University, wrote this book, The New Jim Crow. Much of what I'm talking about today relates to the parallels that she draws. But here's a quote from a very aware, very justice-oriented woman, teacher, educator, citizen. Never did she imagine the possibility that a new racial case could exist. Almost invisible, operating in our country. And she spent most of her time fighting justice. And so I thought that that particular quote deserved its own slide, because one of the messages today is that what she called the new Jim Crow, I sort of refer to, from my perspective in criminal justice administration and teaching, as a structural racism. And it's invidious because it's invisible. I've been teaching corrections for 30 years. I ask my students whether they ever see a line outside the county jail, people trying to get in. You don't take a number like you go, you want to get some ham sliced at Big Y. People don't line up to go to jail. People don't line up to go to jail. And the public conception of jail is something that we have so much work to do around increasing understanding of the caging of human beings. Because at the very baseline, fundamental bottom of the concept of how we punish in America is putting people in a cage. We have laws that prohibit tying up our dogs on a chain outside for long periods of time. But as a hopefully humane alternative to what we viewed as flogging and corporal physical punishments, we developed a notion that incarceration, deprivation of liberty, is somehow the more humane alternative. And then we didn't go back and revisit that. We've just done it over and over and over again. And when we add concepts around power elites, which I will develop from Bill Domhoff's work, and racism, implicit, explicit, and in between, we develop a Molotov cocktail of mistreatment, unnecessary treatment, and complete and utter disregard for members of our own community, for our fellow citizens. So, how does Supreme Court pronouncements which give rights to people and recognize rights to people and create enforcement mechanisms in court for people allow Jim Crow to persist? So I want to raise a name which maybe you're familiar with. If you've taught history, I'm sure you are. Senator Robert Wagner. This book is 40 years old now. I'm a book guy. And this was a book that I had at Holy Cross College in political science, and I keep it near to me. My wife was so happy when she found out that I was going to take over criminal justice and I was going to get the books out of the hallway in our home that have been moved over and over and over again. Senator Robert Wagner and the Rise of Urban Liberalism represents Joseph Huthmacher's attempt to recognize the work of one man in attempting during the New Deal era to bring equity and justice and fairness to people, irrespective of their race, irrespective of their ethnicity, irrespective of their cultural, ideological, or geographical location. And I love to talk about him because he wasn't fighting for the upper class. He wasn't fighting for the 1%. In fact, they had to calm him down during the debate over the concept of the Fair Labor Standards Act when a fellow Democrat from Maryland by the name of Millard Tydings tried to quiet him down. He stood up and he asked the question, who are these people that we're talking about? Who are these workers we're talking about? Is there some reason why they should be in chains? Just a giant in the New Deal. And so he proposed the Social Security Act. He proposed the Fair Labor Standards Act. He proposed workmen's compensation. He understood the necessity of accommodating Southern policy demands very quickly, though. In 1935 and in 1936 and in 1937, when he was attempting to achieve union membership for American workers, not just in the northern cities, but all over the country, he understood the importance politically of accommodating Southern policy demands when he saw the 1934 version of his anti-lynching bill die without even making it out of committee. So this is where it gets tough, because this is where we begin to talk about the power elites and the alliances that developed over time in the 20th century, even in a period of progressive public policy legislation to leave out African Americans, to perpetuate a system of degradation and subjugation in the South. So we're all familiar with it. Total physical and social segregation, routine and systematic violation of the due process rights of African Americans by our criminal justice system. Powell versus Alabama, Brown versus Mississippi, the Scottsboro boys. Absolutely draconian treatment, running roughshod over due process principles by local courts and local county courts. Legal discrimination under the separate but equal doctrine was okay. Schools, public transportation, participation at other public venues, poll taxes, literacy tests, which then turned into voter suppression, intimidation, exclusion from memberships in clubs and in unions, and anti-miscegenation laws, misspelled. I apologize for that. I corrected it and probably didn't save it. Anti-miscegenation laws, everybody aware of what that is, right? If you're not, please put up your hand and I'll tell you what it is. Anti-miscegenation laws were laws passed in many states, predominantly southern states, making it a criminal act to have an interracial marriage. And finally, the case of Loving versus Virginia was made into a movie called Loving. So now we need to see where these things start to come together. And because I couldn't keep you for a month, I found out we couldn't get pillows and sleeping bags. So I had to figure out, what do I talk about? How do I put the political awareness and the historical perspective and the criminal justice stuff together in ways that we can say, and many of my students are here, and how many times do you hear me say, segregation didn't fall out of the sky. Wouldn't it be wonderful, colleagues, if we could just deus ex machina our way through our subject matter? It just fell out of the sky, God from the machine, and we can explain it that way. History matters. And we don't teach history. And I'm feeling Dovi right now. We don't teach history. So I make my students choose their definition. Here's mine. I had to choose this in 1976, and I was afraid of the Zavarian brothers, so I never forgot it. History is the record of what one age finds worthy of note in another. Jacob Burckhardt, Swiss historian, 1818, 1897, comma, and any other things that happened and nobody wants to talk about. History. How do we know what to do if we don't know what happened? How can we build and construct future if we don't know what came before? And so my students are probably saying, oh my God, here he goes again. We need to understand history. It's easy for me to say that because I have trouble with math. Is Linda Kavanaugh here? Hi. Okay. So now I picked union rights, unionization, because union rights and unionization were the keys to employment opportunity in the United States. They were the keys to the middle class in the United States. And urban renewal. And what I have to say about urban renewal isn't really fun to hear, but I'm going to say it. So my good friend, Bill Domhoff, professor emeritus, UCLA, Santa Cruz, political sociologist, not a mainstream guy. Here's another book that my wife is happy we took off the shelf, Who Rules America? This is the original 1967 edition. But he has a website. Please go on the website, whorulesamerica.net. Take a look at all of the articles that he continues to provide. So he said he doesn't accept emails. I sent him an email anyway. Okay, last year he emailed me back. I was jumping around in the kitchen. Bill Domhoff sent me an email. Who's Bill Domhoff? I said, would you consider ever coming into the East Coast? He says, no. He said, but I'm on, no, I like Santa Cruz. But I'm on YouTube. So all my students know who Bill Domhoff is, and if we haven't seen him yet in some of your classes, you will. Bill Domhoff doesn't use the standard Dahl and other sociological explanations. He weaves the public policy with the politics, with the reality, with the power elites. He's the father of power theory. I keep his book right next to this book because we can learn from Bill Domhoff. So by 1938, he says the entire ownership class in the United States had become united against Senator Wagner's Labor Relations Act, but the working class was divided by intra-class war. Does that sound familiar to you? Who's doing that? Who's doing that? This is my way of saying we're puppets. Okay, so what's happening is we have a situation going on in the South that is untenable. It's absolutely untenable. And we are now changing the dynamic of public policy discussion in our Congress. It's the New Deal. We're in a depression. We're in trouble. Unemployment is rampant. The country's falling apart economically. And Senator Wagner is in New York State fighting with his own party, fighting with the Republican Party, fighting with the power elites, fighting with the banks, fighting with the insurance companies. And then suddenly, we figure out that when the Labor Relations Act passes, you'll note in 1935, that was a year after that anti-lynching bill didn't even get out of committee. Okay, so we need to connect these dots. So Wagner files anti-lynching legislation. Oh my God. In the United States, anti-lynching legislation, and it doesn't pass. And so what happens with the Labor Relations Act? Wagner says, I get something or I get nothing. So it excludes agricultural and domestic workers in a nod to Southern political and business interests. This is what Bill Domhoff talks about. He talks about power theory from the standpoint of the development of power elites. And it is his viewpoint that America is run from the local level all the way to the top by power elites that express themselves in different ways, in different times, and they coalesce around principles that involve the commodification of property and economic benefit. 1937, attempts by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was having an internal argument with the American Federation of Labor. Remember, it were two separate organizations. Then it became the AFL-CIO. Attempts to unionize Southern industrial workers met with stiff resistance. Southern sheriffs, Southern police officers, controlled by wealthy white business property owners, creating fear and tensions between and among Southern workers. So we have two dynamics going on now. There aren't enough jobs, right? We don't look at full unemployment as a good, right? All that does is drive up wages. So we assume some unemployment to be good for a well-functioning economy that doesn't heat up, right? Well, when we have major dislocation and major lack of opportunity, we create tension between white workers and African American workers. And then we create more tension between African American workers who want to stand up and be unionized and their white counterparts and their African American counterparts who say, keep your head down. You don't want to be arrested. Do you want to keep the job? Keep your head down. And so Wagner recognizes that this is a non-starter, and he wants to do the best that he can do. Starting around 1900 all the way through to the 1960s, scholars refer to the Great Migration of African Americans from the southern states to the north in search of a better life, in search of opportunity for things that everybody is told they can have if you work hard. You can own a home, you can have a pension, you can raise a family. We say that cavalierly, but we don't apply it across the board. Now, some interesting things start to happen that are a little scary to talk about. alliances start to form between Southern Democrats and certain people who have achieved some status in their area in the North, predominantly Catholics and people of Jewish origin who had sort of come to have some status and means, and Domhoff refers to them as the ethnic rich. And they emerged to oppose what Domhoff refers to as the liberal labor coalition. This is going to have a huge impact because this is going to impact on what we do about cities. What happens to urban America happens based upon alliances and control of congressional committees in the United States Congress. And so that sets the stage for political machines in the cities. Okay? Political machine, dirty word? We could spend hours talking about that. Political machine is a mechanism dominated primarily by a political party, but we must always be mindful of this. We shouldn't be fooled by the title or the name of the political party. As Domhoff has convinced me in all of the books and articles that I've read that were written by him, our nation is most concerned at the toppest policy levels with asserting the dominance of the elite group or the elite class at any given time in our history. And whatever alliance is necessary to achieve that is what we end up having. And that can be uncomfortable to talk about, right? Of course it is. Of course it is. I'm Catholic, ethnic. I'm white, though. I have no idea. I can say what it's like to be a Catholic kid with a Polish mother. Have the public school kids chase you because you have a funny-looking uniform on. I have no idea. We have no idea what our African American brothers and sisters deal with every day. So urban renewal and economic opportunity comes along, and I'm putting some pretty bold language up there. I'm calling that code for the ghettoization of American cities. And I'm not an apologist in that regard because I think it's true. So Domhoff has an entire article that he writes that's dedicated to the Ford Foundation. Many foundations in our nation, right? We have the Rockefellers, we have the Carnegies, we have the Fords. Giants of industry. Giants of industry. Okay? We revere them. Did they make a contribution? Did they create jobs? Sure they did. Sure they did. But it's not always all good news. So the Ford Foundation, according to Domhoff, had some allies in the power elite. And so I put his claim right up there on the slide, that urban renewal really started out as a part of a land grab by downtown business interests, morphing into a set of measures to transition the inner city from mostly white to mostly black. When I first read that, I said, this guy's out to lunch. Really? Then I go back and read it again. Then you look at some spatial displacement studies in places like Baltimore that I'm going to talk about. And you take a look at South Chicago, dominated by machine politics for the past 70 years. You think there's a power elite there? Of course it is. And it's our job to say it. It's our job to say what it is. Irrespective of the political party, we have to admit what is. So urban renewal sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Urban renewal, right? We're going to rejuvenate. We're going to do these great things. It's going to be beautiful. We're going to build a casino. Urban renewal displaces tens of thousands to make room for office buildings, university expansion, convention centers, freeways, low-income housing and employment opportunities make it to the bottom of the list of the priorities of this alliance that we talked about. We have northern elites. This is in the Congress now. We have the machine politicians in the north, and we have the southern folks in the Congress from the southern states. They have a lock on the congressional committees. So when we start to talk about urban renewal money, and it comes to the community development foundations in our communities, wait till we see how that really gets handled. So block grants, come directly. This is a specific piece of legislation. What I love about Domhoff is he keys in on the detail. When community development block grant legislation came to the Congress, the alliance that I'm talking about ensured as little oversight as possible so that another group that Domhoff refers to as local growth elites in the communities, in the cities, in the towns, would be able to direct that money. And the way they direct that money has to do with the difference between exchange value of property and use value of property. Anybody know the difference? We build a park, use value. We build a convention center, exchange value. We commodified land from the days of the framing of the Constitution because who were the framers of the Constitution? The landed aristocracy. The landed aristocracy formed our nation, and that's why Stuntz from Harvard University talks about this idea of Constitution worship. It's unpatriotic not to say good things about the Constitution. The Constitution was framed by the landed aristocracy, who happened also to be, in the majority at least, slave owners. Did they have self-interest in mind when they framed our Constitution? Human nature? Human nature? So by 1935, the genesis of all this, any move to build public housing in the cities for both middle and lower class had been scuttled. Urban renewal and city politics rears its ugly head in places like Chicago and Baltimore, and those are two cities that I want to spend some time talking about. And just a reminder, we have a 50% African American prison population in the state of Illinois. Baltimore's in Maryland, 72% incarcerated in their prisons. This particular slide is very disturbing. The University of Chicago in 1941, one master's thesis was entitled "The Negro Invasion of the Washington Park Subdivision." In 1951, at the same university, the Neighborhood Improvement Association, a counterforce to the expansion of Chicago's Negro population. In neighboring Michigan, in the city of Detroit, Wayne State University, 1960 dissertation, a study of a neighborhood's initial response to Negro invasion. I'll give you a second to think about that. That's why I love Bill Domhoff. History. What's most ironic about the University of Chicago is they're famous for inventing sociology, or at least forming the first sociology department of record in about 1892. And the Chicago School is about what? Linda? Social disorganization. Social disorganization. I guess they knew what they were talking about because they were looking out the window. What is the most racially supercharged place that we can think of in the United States today in terms of urban America? Chicago's right up there, isn't it? So today, as Michelle Alexander reports, 55% of adult black males in Chicago have felony records. Situational crime prevention is referred to euphemistically as spatial displacement. Don't you like that? So Baltimore went through an exercise starting around the 1990s. And they kind of figured out they've got this beautiful, although small, area that abuts the ocean. People love to go there, except it was filled with poverty and crime and dilapidated buildings. So they engaged in a project paid for by urban renewal dollars, known as the Inner Harbor Fells Point Camden Yards Project, and they made major aesthetic improvements, and they created a huge increase in revenue to the harbor areas, including the Camden Yards redevelopment section, which of course is where you go if you want to watch the Orioles. And they saw a concomitant decrease in crime in the redevelopment zone due to increased what? Security presence, right? Security presence, because if you want to attract people with money to come down somewhere and enjoy they don't want to worry about crime. Okay? What we don't report on is crime increases outside the redevelopment zone as African American neighborhoods are disrupted and increased in density. I heard a commentator last year talking about the fact that if our public policy in America is to fail to recognize racial justice to the point that we continue to lock up our fellow citizens in cities and think that everything's going to be okay, we're barking up the wrong tree. We're barking up the wrong tree. It's absurd to think about that. It's ridiculous. It's dehumanizing. It's discriminatory. It's almost savage. And then it's not really very popular in the law and order framework to talk about structural disadvantage in a neighborhood. Wow, look, you know what? Everybody's got a story. Deal with it. Right? Yeah, we do, don't we? How many folks in this room have experienced some sort of trauma in our lives? Everybody has. That's not the right way to view the topic. Structural disadvantage is real. Environmental conditions impact decision-making and lives. Our criminal justice system is based on what we call rational choice theory. We all are rational, and we all make choices, and we use free will to make the choices, and we deserve whatever we get if we make the wrong choice. And that gave birth to deterrence, which in the drug war means if we don't solve the war this year, we can increase the sentences and make the punishment longer and incarcerate more people. And we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again because the theory's flawed. Rational choice theory does not take into account social conditions. But the improvements in the city were very successful in attracting middle-class whites, which is what we refer to as gentrification. Right? Gentrification. The goal, according to Bill Domhoff, of all downtown growth elites in communities large and small. Now, I'm a member of an organization called LEAP, which is the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and we're a group of unpopular, retired public safety practitioners who talk about the real facts, like the failure of the drug war and racial disparity and the abomination of the American sentencing system. So here's a fact, and it's not a fun fact, I'm so sorry to say. At the same time that we made all those beautiful changes to one section of Baltimore, 60,000 heroin addicts now live in the city of Baltimore. 60,000 heroin addicts live in Baltimore. Baltimore is either at the very top or very close to the very top of the scale for heroin addiction in the United States. And we don't solve that with the criminal law. We don't solve it with sentences. We don't solve it with punishment. And we don't solve it by failing to recognize that early on when we declared a drug war in 1970, the notion of punishing people disparately, out of the gates. Crack cocaine, more prominent in African American neighborhoods. That's where our enforcement efforts went, and that's where the punishment went. Well, white powder cocaine, middle-class white people like that. So we won't punish that as severely. And so Nixon came out, and we all know that there was H.R. Haldeman was in the White House, and there was a strategy, sometimes it's referred to as the Southern strategy, when we talk about political science and the Electoral College. But there was a strategy that sought to it was a recognition that we had to drive Jim Crow underground because it was no longer popular. Blatant Jim Crow had to go. And this is where Michelle Alexander says, oh my God, I've been doing this my whole life, and I'm an African American woman, and how did we all of a sudden have a structural system and new racial caste in the United States operating behind the scenes? It starts here. It starts here. Supported by every successive administration. So what do I mean by that? Every administration after Nixon either level funded or increased funding for the drug war. Every one. Massive increases in criminal sentences began during the Reagan administration, supported by another massive increase in sentences under the Clinton administrations. 3 strikes and you're out. Mandatory minimums. Successively longer prison terms with enforcement directed predominantly, if not exclusively in some states, in African American neighborhoods. Now, who's more likely to use marijuana, white teenagers or African American teenagers? Both? Statistics in Massachusetts show us that whites are more likely here to use marijuana than African Americans. But where do we devote our public safety and law enforcement efforts? Communities of color. Communities of color. Is it the cops' fault? See, it's more complicated than that. Policymakers. Policymakers. Political elites. We're going to talk about the Corrections Corporation of America in a minute. So we see this enforcement penalties disproportionately targeted to minority citizens. $60 billion a year is spent on the drug war. Another $81 billion is spent on corrections annually. The use and sale of drugs are at an all-time high. In 2002, California spent 18% of its budget on prisons and 2% on higher education. California, 25% of the United States economy. Legal discrimination in the age of equal rights. This is where Michelle Alexander says, our system of government slams the door on African Americans. United States versus Armstrong is a United States Supreme Court case that is decided in 1996. It's in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Middle District of California. 5 African American defendants come before the court indicted for drug trafficking. The discovery phase of a criminal trial is where you gather information, you ask questions. And so they filed a motion to ask or compel the prosecutor to provide statistics of a 3-year period of both white and African American potential defendants. You see, because prosecutors have what we call the presumption of regularity. You get selected to participate in the criminal justice process. People don't realize that. You get selected. Prosecutors choose who to indict and who not to indict. And so they asked for statistics on criminal defendants who could have been but not were indicted, who were similarly situated, aka selling drugs, but were white. It would take me too long to explain the details. By an 8-1 majority, the United States Supreme Court denied their motion and said that they didn't meet the threshold, and here's the threshold. They had to demonstrate by naming similarly situated individuals that could have been but were not prosecuted, and then they had to show discriminatory purpose and discriminatory effect. And the Supreme Court said, the only people that have that information are the prosecutors, and you can't have it. How does that happen? I'll tell you how it happens. Professor Stuntz at Harvard University said it when he wrote his book, The Collapse of American Criminal Justice. It's called Constitution worship, ladies and gentlemen. The Supreme Court was more concerned about checks and balances, the judiciary not interfering with the executive branch, the prosecutor, and preserving the presumption of regularity. That's like saying to a 10-year-old African-American school child in South Carolina in 1953, that's okay. You can handle segregation. 40 or 50 years from now, the world will come to its senses. That's what that's like. United States Supreme Court, what are we taught? That our judicial system is the great arbiter of fairness and justice. If you get a chance to read this book by Jerry Spence, With Justice for None. He's 89. Yes, I emailed him. And yes, he emailed me back. Lives in Wyoming. He's famous for the Silkwood case, where Keir McGee was contaminating its own employees with radiation and not telling them. But he's more than that. He was a prosecutor. He represented insurance companies. He quit that business. He started his own law school because he can't stand how we turn out lawyers in America without teaching about justice. And I have to share the quote with you. So he says, the new king, an amorphous agglomeration of corporations, banks, insurance companies, mammoth multinational corporations, maintains a prurient passion for money and demands a justice of its own. One that's stable and predictable, one that fits into columns and accounts and mortality tables, one that's interpretable in dollars, so that a little justice is a few dollars and a lot of justice is too many dollars. The new king can't deal with the soul, the fire, and the unpredictability of the human spirit and human justice. Profit is the lifeblood of business and of the American way. And if there's no profit and justice, people are not likely to receive it. What do you think of that? That's not how we were raised. So slum clearance and residential displacement happens because Jim Crow goes underground. Insufficient urban housing units planned or built. The housing stock of England and France today is 40 to 50% publicly owned. The housing stock in the United States is less than 1% publicly owned, and it's stigmatized because middle-income public housing was scuttled during the New Deal, like all of those other things we've talked about, and it was stigmatized from the point of origin. So now you can't talk about mixed housing in America, and you can't talk about use value, and so you stack people up in big towers, in terrible places, structural disadvantage abounds. Oh my goodness, where are the sociologists in the room? Self-fulfilling prophecy? You know, I have 2 dogs, and they treat me like a rock star when I get home, and I have no idea why. But if I go home and I kick them every day, if I treat my family that way, if everything about their lives is negative, what do we expect? We need to demonize. We love that. We're a punitive nation. It's not necessary. We can recognize these problems and fix them. Why did we allow banks to redline entire neighborhoods that happen to be substantially African American in cities and deny people future home improvement loans, while at the same time we were funding subsidies for rural suburban housing in concentric circles, if you want to use Chicago school language, in the suburbs for white families? Is that purposeful? I submit that it is. I think we know what we're doing. Erosion of existing employment due to free trade policies. Yeah, we have a global village. We all understand that. But you got to put something in place of the job that goes away. When the person searching for opportunity travels 1,000 miles and tries to set up a lifestyle, and there's no retraining. And both parties are responsible for this. This isn't about Democrats and Republicans. I've heard Democrats stand up and say that globalism is hard. Oh, sure it is. It's easy to say that. And Republicans talk about the fact that the cost of goods and services requires us to take jobs and put them overseas. So we have this erosion. We have a declaration of a drug war with disparate enforcement, increasingly harsh penalties for criminal violations. We have mass incarceration of African American men, ladies and gentlemen, that is disturbing beyond belief, and the emergence of a prison industrial complex in the United States with the following collateral consequences. Felons can't vote. Felons can't serve on juries. Felons can't get jobs. Felons don't qualify for public housing. Felons don't qualify for Pell Grants, other loans, various public assistance. Maybe in some cases they do a little bit of that stuff. And therein lies the development of a permanent undercaste, the new Jim Crow. I want to leave you with one quote that was written in a 2005 report by the Corrections Corporation of America. And I would entreat you to call your congressman and ask them why this is permitted in America. A private prison industry that has the following to say in its annual 2005 report. Our growth is generally dependent upon our ability to obtain new contracts, to develop and manage new correctional and detention facilities. The demand of our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently proscribed by our criminal laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. So, I'm not a big runner, but I think if every one of us is willing to take a piece of the baton, we can continue the work. I asked Mary one thing. What's one thing that Dovi cared to achieve? And she said, to make people understand why it's important not to objectify African Americans and African culture. And I know he was an avid anti-colonialist, and I am too. And of course, I'm sure he also agreed with the comment that Martin Luther King gave us. Judge me by the content of my character, not the color of my skin. Thank you.